Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer.
Amen.
Amen. O God, you declare your mighty power chiefly in showing mercy. What we do, what we say, makes a difference. The choices and decisions we make a difference. We are called to love one another. As we live into our call to love one another, God's mercy and love for us is often revealed. How we live our lives affects not only our life, but lives of those around us, our families, our communities, and beyond. Whether our choices and decisions are small or large, insignificant or clearly life-changing, what we say, what we do makes a difference. Who we love, how we love makes a difference. When we think about Scripture and the individuals named and unnamed, who are the people who come to your mind first? How many of them are men, and how many are women? There are only 2 books about women's lives in the Old Testament, Ruth and Esther, along with one in the Apocrypha, Judith. In the Old and New Testaments, along with the Apocrypha, there are 34 men named. Rarely are the books and stories concerning women's lives found in our lectionary, and I wonder about that. When their stories appear, they are not often the focus. Today, we have Esther's story. How many of us here have heard of Esther? How many of us can recount her entire story? In today's story about Esther, as in many scripture stories which find their way into our lectionary, the harder, more difficult parts of the story are left out of the telling. We human beings and our stories are more often than not messy and difficult. They do not always show us in our best light. Esther's story takes place after the Babylonian exile, when some but not all of the Jews had moved back to Israel. Esther's family were some of those who remained behind, having built a life for themselves in Persia, modern-day Iran. The Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible tells us that the story of Esther tells the story of the deliverance of the Jews won by Esther under the Persians, and gives a reason for the institution of Purim, a symbol of the heroic resistance against persecution. She was a young girl. She was an immigrant, caught up in the gathering of young virgins from their families in all of the kingdom of Persia. And her name was Hadassah, which means myrtle. Hadassah was taken by the king's men from her uncle Mordecai, who had adopted her when her parents had died. The young girls knew all about Queen Vashti, who had defied the king by refusing to attend his banquet. Instead, the queen had her own banquet for women. This angered and worried the king, who called his advisors for their advice about what to do. Though women had some freedom and autonomy in the kingdom, this felt like too much. After all, what if every woman decided to defy their husbands? What would happen? They advised the king that he should send the queen away and find himself another woman to serve as his queen. Therefore, this huge roundup of the virgins. Hadassah came from a different culture than the others. She and her uncle were part of the Jewish community living in the kingdom, and she became known as Esther in her new community. For a year, she and the other young girls were prepared in the harem to be presented one at a time to the king. They were all supervised by the palace eunuchs assigned to do the job. What was that like for her? She had to learn new customs, new rules of behavior. One of the eunuchs happened to befriend her, and he helped her to understand what she needed to do and instructed her on what she would need to know for her survival and for her possible selection as the next queen. Her uncle Mordecai taught her well. He knew that it would not be helpful for her to tell others that she was a Jew, so she remained silent. Perhaps that's what Jews did in Persia. They kept their heritage secret. It was a way to survive and maybe thrive. Her uncle kept watch over her from a distance, staying as often as he could by the palace gates. When Esther's turn came to be brought to the king, she was admired by him and eventually chosen to become his queen. Now she had new privileges and new responsibilities. All that she had learned, she carried with her into her new role. Those around her saw her as beautiful and quiet, one who knew and followed the rules. She was not at all like the former queen, Vashti, until her story became bound up in the story of another, Haman, the new head advisor to the king. Haman was nothing at all like Mordecai or Esther. He was an ambitious and jealous man. At one point, Haman comes across Mordecai at the palace gates, and he goes up to Mordecai and he says, "Bow down to me," because he thought he should, because of his position as the king's head advisor. Mordecai refused. Haman was furious. He returned to the palace determined to punish Mordecai. He discovered that Mordecai was a Jew whose practices did not allow him to bow. Haman decided to go to the king to ask him to have all of the Jews in the kingdom killed because of their customs and refusal to bow to those in authority. So the king issued a decree that all Jews, men, women, and children, should be killed. Haman had chosen the day for the executions by lot. When Mordecai found out about the decree, he put on sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai and Esther had been in regular communication with one another through the palace eunuchs. And he sends to Esther the news about the decree and asks her to intercede with the king to stop the slaughter. Esther, being a good girl, at first refuses Mordecai. She tells him, I have not been in front of the king. I've not been invited to be in his presence for quite a while now. Mordecai insists. Reluctantly, she says she'll go to the king. And then she tells Mordecai to go to their people and ask them to fast for 3 days while she prepares herself. 3 days later, she dresses in her royal robes and stands at the entrance to the king's chamber, waiting. Was she frightened? Did she think she would be banished or killed for coming into his presence uninvited? Somehow she had found courage. The king invites her in. She tells him, I have a petition I would like you to consider. But first, she says to the king, would you and your advisor Haman come to a banquet at my quarters tomorrow? The king calls in Haman and tells him about the invitation. Both say that they will come. Haman, in the meantime, runs into Mordecai once again, and Mordecai still refuses to bow. Angrier than the first time, Haman has a huge gallows, 75 feet tall, built by his house to hang Mordecai on when the time came. That night, the king could not sleep. So the next morning he called in his advisors and he asked them to bring their records to him to be read to him. They found in them that Mordecai had notified the king of a plot to take his life. The king had been saved by Mordecai. The king then asked them, well, has Mordecai been rewarded for this? And they said, well, no, he has not. So the king called Haman in and asked him, Haman, what should be done for someone who has assisted the king in such a way as this? And Haman, thinking the king was talking about him, said, well, he should be rewarded with royal robes and a horse. So the king then commissioned Haman to do that for Mordecai. And so Mordecai is fuming, as he did what the king had demanded him. Banquets at this time period were lasted more than one day. On the second day of Esther's banquet, as the king and Esther and Haman were enjoying themselves, the king turns to Esther and asks her what her petition was. And Esther starts telling him, the king, that she is a Jew and that there was a decree out to kill all the Jews, which would include her. And she asked the king to revoke the decree. The king now is clearly very upset, and he asks her who said this decree, who put this in place. And Esther turns and looks at Haman and said, he did. So the king ordered Haman to be hung on the very gallows that he had built to hang Mordecai. The king also to stop the decree. Esther had saved her people. Mordecai was given Haman's job. And Esther had a holiday declared, and they all celebrated. So what does this story have to do with us? There is no overt reference to God in this story. So I recommend that it's a very short book. Take a look at the book Esther. No God mentioned there. And Esther, when she asked the people to fast, doesn't ask them to pray. Still, this story, a seemingly simple story, managed somehow to find and keep a place in our scripture. It is a story in which a woman found the courage to step out and step up for a people at risk. In doing so, she risked her own life. Through Esther and Mordecai's actions, God's mercy is present and saves the lives of an exiled community of Jews. We do not have to be a queen like Esther, who saves a whole community. But we can make a difference with one piece of trash picked up off the beach. We can make a difference with one soup ladle of soup served at a soup kitchen for the homeless. One piece of clothing donated to a clothing bank. One lunch packed for food for kids. One hammer blow on a Habitat house. With one book read to a child, or one child's book donated. An hour spent mentoring a teenager. We can make the difference by using our own bags at the grocery store, turning up the air conditioning, or opening a window, turning off a light when we leave a room, helping an immigrant. Small things done together with others make a difference. Each of us, in small ways, makes a difference. One last story that I'm quite sure many of you have heard before, but it just fits right here. There was a couple walking the beach who noticed thousands of starfish scattered all across the beach ahead of them. Standing in the midst of them, they saw a figure lean down, pick it up, and throw it into the water. Then lean down again and pick one up and throw it into the water. As they got closer, they called out to him, "Why are you doing that? There are so many starfish. What difference will it make?" The man looked down, picked up another starfish, tossed it into the water. It made a difference for that one. What will we do?